Coming up, we are going to learn how you can run Azure Arc enabled data services on AKS on Azure Stack HCI in your own data center or at your edge location. Hey, I'm here with Dhananjay, PM at the Azure Arc enabled data services team. Hi, Dhananjay.
Hi, Thomas.
Great to have you today, and we are going to talk about how you actually can deploy and run Azure Arc enabled data services on top of AKS on Azure Stack HCI. But before we actually go into this, obviously customer environments are evolving in these hybrid and multi-cloud environments. Can you explain us a little bit more about that?
Customers are seeing some of the benefits of moving to the cloud. That is a positive, but at the same time, there are more challenges that they're facing. They have this diverse infrastructure from on premises of traditional servers that they have in their own data centers, as well as having to deal with Azure cloud and third party clouds, because many of our customers are multi cloud. Number two, now they have a diverse set of tools, diverse set of technologies to deal with, so increases that complexity. Number three, they do know that they have to modernize their data centers and make sure that they are moving to the clouds. The faster that they move, they enable new business capabilities that are happening with this seismic shift. And number four, many of the cloud services are allowing them to do new things, and they would love to have those cloud services on their different clouds. And that's where Azure Arc comes in.
So you mentioned Azure Arc. How can Azure Arc actually help our customers?
Azure Arc is a set of technologies that truly enables Azure Hybrid. So there are two aspects to it. There's Azure Arc enabled infrastructure and Azure Arc enabled services. With Azure Arc enabled infrastructure, the diverse infrastructure that I was talking about can all be connected to Azure, and through a single control plane, customers can manage it, see the inventory, manage the lifecycle, and make sure that they're secure. On top of it goes Azure Arc enabled services. So Arc allows customers to bring in some of the key services that customers have been using in the public cloud, such as Azure Threat and Analytics, Azure Monitor. Now, all of these services run on that Azure Arc enabled infrastructure.
If a customer cannot use an Azure service in one of our Azure regions, we're actually bringing the Azure services to the customer location. So that is awesome. And today we're going to have a look at one of these services, namely the Azure Arc enabled data services part. Can you explain us a little bit more about that, how that service is actually working in the customer's locations?
As we know, Azure Arc enabled data services is to bring those services, Thomas, that you talked about in the cloud, such as Azure SQL managed instance on premises, and get those benefits that customers get from running in the cloud, which is completely managed by Microsoft through Azure, onto their premises on any hardware, any infrastructure, any Kubernetes distribution that has been validated. At the same time, they can also run in VMs with Azure Arc enabled SQL Server. But let's focus today on Azure Arc enabled data services. One of the problems that customers have said is that they want their service to be always current, SQL to be evergreen, patched, updated. This is where Arc enabled data services, once it's deployed on your on premises cluster or third party cloud, helps you be always current, because the databases and data engines that are deployed are automatically deployed through policy, controlled through policy, can be patched and updated through policy, so that they're always current. And as a customer, I'm not worried about, do I have any security vulnerabilities? Next, elastic scale, which is a key aspect of using the cloud. They can get that elasticity, whether they want to scale out or scale up, just by changing some configuration and deploying that policy across their several clusters. As you know, Arc enabled Azure Arc connects them to the Azure portal or Azure cloud. Now they can use the Azure portal and any of the tools that they're used to in the past, like Azure Data Studio or even Azure CLI, to manage these through a unified set of tools, unified set of interfaces, and a single platform that goes across their public cloud as well as on premises clouds and third party clouds. And thus, Azure Arc enabled data services gives the customers that cloud experience so that they can run their containerized workloads on any cloud of their choice. And by the way, one more thing important to know is that while Azure Arc enabled data services running on Arc enabled Kubernetes can be always used in a connected mode, we also have capabilities to work in an indirectly connected mode because we understand that in certain customer environments, they do not want to either directly connect their data services to the cloud or internet for compliance reasons, or they may have connectivity challenges due to the environmental conditions where they want to run the compute workloads and use some of the services that they get in the cloud.
Yeah, I love that. Again, it's very awesome to see that our customers can take advantage of an Azure service running outside of Azure and getting all these benefits you just mentioned. Now, you also said that obviously to run Azure Arc enabled data services, you need a Kubernetes cluster to actually deploy the data controller and actually deploy the solution on it. Now, we have obviously customers who do run a lot of Kubernetes, but we also have customers who probably don't currently run one, or they're looking to have a more integrated solution. So what can we offer to these customers who do not have a Kubernetes cluster yet in their environment they can leverage?
Great point. Many of our customers who come more from a SQL or database background are not familiar with Kubernetes. And that's where Microsoft has realized that challenge, and we have come up with having a solution for them on premises with Azure Kubernetes service that they get in Azure Cloud to be running on premises with Azure Stack HCI, which is Microsoft's Azure Stack at the edge with a hyper-converged infrastructure. So once customers get the Azure Stack HCI with hyper-converged infrastructure, which is built to our specifications, working with some of the OEMs, they can easily deploy Azure Kubernetes service on top of it and get all the benefits of Kubernetes and the simplicity that they get in the cloud on premise. Now, what are the key reasons why I would propose they want to do it? One is it all comes from Microsoft. So if you are using Azure or you're having lots of Windows applications and SQL Server, that can run side by side with your containerized applications. So you have a good transition path from using virtualized applications all the way to containers. Azure AKS or Azure Kubernetes Service on HCI is hybrid by design. It's AKS consistent Kubernetes cluster management, so you get the same experience that you get in public cloud on premises. It's easy deployment on Azure Stack HCI, which I'll show later on in a demo. And plus, it's built in with Arc capabilities. So because it's hybrid by design, so some of the things that they would have to do on a third-party on-premises cloud or third-party public cloud, those are all simplified, and you can truly deliver that hybrid capability with simple configuration. Number two, as I mentioned, if you have Windows apps, you can run them right next to the Linux apps. It is the best platform that's out there for running your .NET applications with local administration provided through Windows Administration Control and a differentiated container solution if you're using Windows containers. Built-in security, it is secure by default. It's a trusted platform on which we have truly hardened container images that get deployed. Mariner Linux, which we have really hardened and made sure it's secure. The deployments and the configurations are all secure, and it's always up to date. Your infrastructure is always up to date with the latest security updates and patches without having to do any special changes on your side or new workflows to do it. And plus, most importantly, if you're using Azure Active Directory, it's integrated with Active Directory and comes in with a built-in certificate authority, so you can issue new certificates. So it's hybrid by design, best platform to run your .NET applications, as well as a migration path to go from traditional monolith applications to containerized applications, and built-in security, which is what makes it the best platform to run Arc enabled data services.
Okay, now this all sounds absolutely amazing. Again, I love how we obviously offer that full stack integrated system, basically, like for customers who really want to have a solution for this, or customers who already, for example, are familiar with AKS in Azure. They can now run it in their own data centers in the same way, basically, as they know to, and then obviously they get a lot of benefit out of that. So really, really cool stuff. Now, so can you show us a little bit more around this?
Yeah, so what I'll do is I'll first, we've had a lot of talk, so let me demonstrate how to deploy, how easy it is to deploy an AKS cluster on AKS HCI. First, we'll deploy the management cluster, and then we'll deploy the cluster on which you'll run your Arc-enabled data services. Now we are going to see how we can use AKS HCI to run Arc-enabled data services on an AKS cluster running on an HCI machine. Here I have an HCI machine with compute, storage, and network running in my data center in my lab. And I've already set up HCI on it. I'm going to show you how easy it is to set up AKS on that HCI machine and then install data services on top of it. So first we'll set up the management cluster or the Azure Kubernetes service, and then we'll go on to deploy the workload cluster, which we will Arc enable, and then install data services on top of it. Now to set up the AKS on HCI, there are two ways you can do it. One is using PowerShell commandlets. The other one is using the new Windows Admin Center. I'm going to show you today how to use the Windows Admin Center. In simple 6 steps or 5 steps, you can set up an Azure Kubernetes service on Windows Admin Center using Windows Admin Center. So first, I want to check the prerequisites that this HCI machine or the Windows Server cluster that is going to host this AKS has a virtual switch, at least sufficient memory, storage, and is registered with Azure and has the networking capabilities that are required. Next, by entering the password, I'm going to make sure that all the system checks are run, the system is ready to install AKS, and the things that are missing, such as the PowerShell modules, can be installed before we make further progress. Right now, the system is going through a bunch of checks on the HCI machine, making sure that I can install PowerShell modules on top of it. As you can see, the Windows Admin Center is already connected to Azure, and it has the firewall rules and volumes that are required, as well as the virtual switch. So as we install the PowerShell modules, we'll go next to the host configuration. Going into the host configuration, we can give the cluster whatever name we want. In this case, we're calling it the AKS Management Cluster 1, or you can say Contoso Cluster 1. We want to select the storage where we are going to store the VM images. We are going to also select the switch and set the configuration here as DHCP, or you can create it as static, and give an IP range for the load balancer. Once that is done, I've already set up this machine to be connected to Azure. And from that, I can pull down the Azure subscription, which is going to be used, and a resource group in which this cluster will be reflected in Azure, so that I can go to the Azure portal and in that resource group, see all my on-premises cluster. Finally, I'll select the Azure region from which I'm going to connect to this cluster, review all the settings that I'm doing, and that's how easy it is. Apply these changes. Once these changes get applied, the configuration is set up. Azure Kubernetes service can be set up on this machine. It's literally that easy to set up AKS on an HCI machine that is already connected to Azure. Now that we have set up the management cluster, let's go on and create a workload cluster in which we want to install Arc-enabled data services. First, we'll go through the basics. We'll connect this cluster directly to Azure so that we can manage it from the Azure portal with policies. Let's select a subscription, a resource group in which this cluster can be selected, a region, then use the cluster password and host username so that you can connect to the cluster. Give that cluster a name, select the version of the Kubernetes, select a primary node pool. Next, let's configure the node pools. Let's add a Linux node pool. Usually you want to select 3 Linux nodes on which you can run data services, SQL managed instance. In this case, we have selected one. Let's add a Windows node pool in which you can run your Windows-based applications and .NET-based applications. Give it a count of 1. And once that is done, you want to set up the authentication. In this case, we won't use AD authentication, but you can set it up. Next, you want to select networking, and between Calico and Flannel, we'll select Calico. Review and create the cluster. Make sure that everything's good. Create the cluster, and within seconds, within a few minutes, the cluster can be created. Once you've done creating the cluster, you can actually connect directly into the Azure portal and view the cluster inside of the Azure portal. So here you go, a connected cluster, a workload cluster that you can manage with Azure policy and centralized billing.
Great demo, Dhananjay. This really helps to understand how you actually deploy this and how actually simple and integrated it is. Now, you mentioned, okay, now we have Azure Stack HCI. On top, we have our Azure Kubernetes service running in our own data center. Now, the next level is, obviously, I want to run Azure Arc enabled data services. How does that look like?
So let's go through the high level architecture so that you understand where data services fits in. When you look at this diagram, there's the hardware ecosystem of our close partners that are building various form factors and various performance and compute and network capable underlying infrastructure or hyperconverged infrastructure that's validated by Microsoft. On top of that, we lay down Azure Stack HCI, our platform to run both containerized Windows.NET as well as Linux-based applications on our hypervisor. And then we saw how easy it was to deploy AKS on that Azure Stack HCI. So you can use the same benefits of AKS on premises. And this is AKS tuned by Microsoft, the same AKS that we do and validate upstream and recognize in the industry, now fine-tuned to run on this Azure Stack HCI. Once you've laid that down, the next step is to deploy Arc-enabled data services on top of it. And typically, you would deploy this in a connected mode because Azure Stack HCI is always connected to the cloud. So as you see on AKS, there's the container platform that runs, as well as you can deploy Arc-enabled data services, Arc-enabled ML, and Arc-enabled application services. But that's kind of the overall solution that comes from running Arc-enabled data services on Azure Stack HCI running AKS.
So can you show me a little bit under the hood how Azure Arc enabled data services runs on top of AKS on Azure Stack HCI?
Great. Yeah, absolutely. You were spot on. This is how, if you want to run your Azure SQL managed instance, here's a brief look of functional architecture that shows the different components. AKS HCI is all these nodes that are running down below with Kubernetes running on our validated hardware, which runs HCI. Once you've laid down Kubernetes, then you would deploy what we call as the controller for Arc-enabled data services. And that controller gives you that connectivity to the Azure cloud for data services. Over here is the Azure cloud on the top and the Microsoft Container Registry through which updates and patches and packages can get downloaded. Once you have that connectivity, you can spin up Azure SQL Managed Instance right from the Azure portal using Azure Data Studio on premises, or even using CLI, as well as using Kubernetes native capabilities and GitOps and all that integration. So they can use whatever tool they're comfortable with or bring in new tools, which are Kubernetes tools to manage the lifecycle of all the data services that are in there. Now, what can they do in terms of managing the lifecycle? Not only can they do CRUD operations from the Azure portal, so spin up, spin down, do deployments, apply policy, make sure that there is data sovereignty, so some of the services are running. But at the same time, they can collect all the logs, see the inventory of all their data services, whether they are running in Azure, on-premises cloud, or a third-party cloud, get billing. And the most exciting thing is that they get cloud billing. So they get billed for only as much as they use. And some of our customers are seeing over 60% savings from able to do that. If they're seeing failures, if they can monitor using Azure Monitor, they can use Azure Threat Analytics and reporting and assessment on premises. And they can get all those logs and metrics centrally so that they can diagnose or even monitor how their services are running. And as we go along, we're bringing more and more of those Azure services, such as backup, identity, security, high availability, disaster recovery for customers to use. And that's what the customers I'm working with love, that now they're getting an Azure SQL managed instance running on premises so that they can comply with their data compliance, data sovereignty, but they're getting some of the benefits of Azure where it's always evergreen SQL. It's updated, patched. If there are failures, this can be centrally managed. They can set policies and truly start delivering database as a service for their customers in their enterprises.
No, I love it. Again, this really enables our customers not just like to run their cloud native or their applications in general in like Azure, but then take the same architecture for the application and bring that to their local data centers or their edge locations like branch offices and factories without doing any redesign of these. So that this is pretty cool. Now, we talked a lot about it. Can you actually show how we would actually deploy Azure Arc enabled data services like the data controller on top of AKS on Azure Stack HCI?
Great idea.
The cloud administrator has now set up the infrastructure with HCI, Azure Kubernetes services running on it, and a workload cluster. He has configured it in such a way that the database administrator and the developer who want to set up the Arc enabled data services and spin up new SQL instances on it can do it independently of having to work with the infrastructure administrator or the cloud administrator. I'm going to switch over to a pre-installed on-premises AKS HCI cluster with several services running on it connected through Azure Arc to the Azure service in the cloud. And you can see it through the Azure portal. Uh, this is Clinic One, which is a resource group representing a cluster residing on a clinic of Contoso Health. Contoso Health is a multinational that has several clinics, and in each of its clinics, it wants to run a set of cloud native as well as traditional applications on clusters that are running within each clinic that are centrally managed through Azure Policy, Azure Monitor, and a whole bunch of services in Azure that are available on premises. As you can see, there are several resources deployed here, not just Kubernetes, and uh, everything from application insights, application services, but more importantly, there's AKS HCI Clinic 1, which is called a Kubernetes Azure Arc cluster in East US EUAP region. What that means is this is not running in Azure Public, but on premises on a Kubernetes cluster inside the customer's data center or database or whatever region the customer is at, and connected through Azure Arc. That's why it can be centrally managed. If I look down the list, there's also a data controller that has been installed, which means this cluster has been enabled for data services, and a database instance is running it, all of which can be managed through Azure Policy centrally. How was that done? Let's look into how easy it is to create from the Azure portal on an on-premises cluster that has been Arc enabled a data services can be enabled, and multiple data services like Azure Arc SQL managed instance can be launched. So let's first create an Azure Arc data controller. And let's hit create. This will put me into a wizard where I have to give certain information that can help configure that cluster to run data services on premises on any Kubernetes cluster that is Arc enabled. So once I get into it, I have two modes in which I can create this Arc enabled Kubernetes cluster. One is the direct mode, which means that I can deploy and manage those services on an existing Azure Arc enabled Kubernetes cluster centrally. And secondly is the indirect mode, where I can deploy and manage services on an existing Kubernetes cluster that is not managed by Azure centrally. I'm going to not go into the differences between the two, but really go into the direct mode configuration and how easy it is to do. There are other videos and other sessions in which the differences between the two and the detailed information about those are already available, and I encourage you to see those. Next, I want to go into the data controller configuration. Since this was already selected as Clinic 1, that resource got pre-populated, the resulting subscription got pre-populated. Now I have to give the data controller a name. Let's say Clentoso Clinic DC1. Next, I have to select a custom location, which is an Azure resource that represents a namespace on that Kubernetes cluster that is residing on premises on which data services can be enabled. So I select that. Next, I select the configuration for this data service. And since we are running on an AKS HCI cluster, that configuration is already loaded. If that was not available, you can always use a custom profile. I'm going to select a load balancer. Next, I have to give some kind of a login. Next, I give a client ID. I'm just going to give some fake values. Additional settings are whether I want to give a log analytics workspace and a key for it. As with any resource, I can give name value pairs, and then here's how I can create a new um, a new Azure Arc data controller on which data services can run. Here I hit create, and it goes off and creates a data controller. Let me also show how I can create a SQL managed instance, because this cluster already has a data controller created on it. So here we go. Here's a SQL managed instance, and I can say create an Azure Arc SQL managed instance. Here I have to give the instance a name. I can select the custom location. I can select the service type and give some kind of a admin name. Next, I can put tags on it, name value pairs, review the information, and hit create. This will create a new SQL managed instance in the custom location, and Clinic 1 will have a new SQL managed instance in that in the resource group. That's how easy it is to configure AKS HCI to run Kubernetes on it, Kubernetes cluster that can run data services on it, enable data services on that Kubernetes cluster, and spin up SQL managed instances to deliver database as a service.
That was a great demo. And again, super easy to actually deploy and manage this. I'm really excited about that. So obviously customers now have the question, so how is actually SQL Managed Instance on top of Azure Stack HCI different than before?
Yeah, yeah, that's really important to understand. While Arc-enabled data services is great on any upstream Kubernetes and even better on validated Kubernetes distros that we are working with third parties on, it is the best with Azure Stack HCI and AKS running on top of it. That's because it's hybrid by default, it is secure, and it is being fine-tuned for performance. And finally, most importantly, the fourth thing is you can run your existing Windows applications as well as third-party virtualized applications and use your container applications all in one. So you can see some savings from using the same infrastructure to run both rather than duplicate it. So hybrid by default, as I showed you, Arc enabled, it's already Arc enabled. It's connected to Azure Cloud. It's enabled with policy. So you can use all the great benefits of Azure policy and bring in all the Azure services to AKS HCI. It is secure by default, as I mentioned. It is locked down, secure, and then finally, soon certificate authority and Azure Active Directory with identity integrated into it. For now, they can use Kubernetes RBAC for local identity within SQL Managed Instance, but in future, we'll be also integrating with the Azure Active Directory. So whether it's day zero to do deployment all the way to day N operations, Azure Arc enabled data services works best on AKS HCI.
Oh, awesome. And since I have you in the call, and you're the right person definitely to ask this question, if I want to deploy now this in my environment, do you have any tips and best practices I should take care of?
Yeah. Now that we know about all the various technologies, some of the tips is what I learned from what our customers are doing, because we are really making this solution work for our customers. So I'm working with a manufacturing customer. There's also financial customers, retail customers who are truly excited with the hybrid technology and ability to use Azure at the edge that we are building. And one of the customers had wanted to completely automate, build a digital factory, which is data driven. Now, they were collecting a lot of data from the factory floor sensors, wanted to analyze it at the edge so that those decisions can be done much faster, much locally. And that is where Azure Stack HCI, AKS running on it, and Azure enabled data services as part of the overall platform made complete sense for them, because they were able to run this on premises with getting data analytics and Azure SQL managed instance running within the factory floor in a highly available environment. So they are using 3-node cluster with a good failover, availability groups, so that SQL is fully available, highly available, but it all looks like a single entry point for it to be access. And these are global factories, so some of them are very well connected with Azure, but some of them have intermittent connectivity loss, and they can run all their operations locally in terms of running SQL ML, collecting all the data from their IoT devices, analyzing it centrally using Azure Arc enabled data services with Azure SQL Edge, gathering all that data, all perfectly well, even if the service gets disconnected from Azure intermittently. So that's what I would suggest, is use Azure Arc enabled data services, containerize your workloads, run them on the most secure, most performant platform, which is AKS HCI, which can be centrally managed through policy, but also can run in an indirectly connected mode if the connectivity is an issue.
And I love that we don't create that dependency to the cloud, right? Because again, as you just mentioned, this is one of the scenarios I heard a lot, is like we have mission critical workloads and we do not have necessarily a very stable connectivity, and that like prevents a lot of scenarios to actually run in the cloud. And with this, it actually enables them to run them like anywhere locally and still take advantage of these cloud services. So obviously, I'm sure a lot of people are now very, very interested in Azure Arc enabled data services running on top of AKS on Azure Stack HCI. So Dhananjay, where can they find more?
We have great documentation online. So I literally touched the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot more information on how this can be configured, what are the true use cases through documentation. But if you want to get a quick service started, you can also use our jump starts, which are available. And we'll have links available to you at the end of this video. We are also using ArcBox, and these jump starts are available in ArcBox. And you can also use Microsoft Learn to learn more about Azure Arc enabled data services. Take advantage of the fact that these data services are coming on premises on the Azure Edge. Try it out, learn more, and do contact us if you have any questions whatsoever. We love to delight you as customers, and we want you to use our platform and our technologies.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dhananjay. And for those who are watching, if you want to learn more about hybrid and multi-cloud architectures, check out our Cloud Adoption Framework and the Azure Architecture Center.